Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Megaprojects. This one is heavily requested. It's the Avro Arrow. I swear every time I release a Megaprojects video that is a plane, you're like, why haven't you done the Avro Arrow yet? And I'm like, well, now I have. Also, a couple other things before we get started. One, I am wearing some fly merch. If you would like to look as fly as me, you can go to megamerch.co. How about that? And purchase this. This one, people come up to you and be like, ooh, nice shirt. Is that the Concorde? You'd be like, actually, no. This is the fake Russian Concorde, the Tupolev. I'm also a massive nerd. You can buy this at megamerch.co along with a ton of other designs. The second thing, if you're not aware yet, is that I have another channel that is called Side Projects, where we cover things that are not quite mega enough for this channel. Soviet space weapons, World War II's greatest airplanes, history's lost treasures, all of that sort of stuff you'll find on Side Projects, which is linked to below along with the merch link. And let's get into it. Finally. The early Cold War era was a time of massive development of aircraft and flight-based armaments. If you've been watching Megaprojects for any time at all, you know that. Most of the examples from this period come from the USA, the USSR, or possibly the UK and France, less famously though. However, perhaps the most interesting of any military aircraft from that era was the Canadian Avro Arrow. The airplane, designed in the 1950s, included one of the most unique and engaging designs in history, including its iconic delta wing. Speaking of, despite its status as a cult favorite, only a small handful of arrows were ever built, and they were all destroyed shortly after completion. In the end, the plane's legacy had as much to do with the political controversy surrounding it as that iconic design. So, let us discuss, at last, the Avro Arrow. In the years following the end of World War II, the USSR began to develop long-range bombers capable of dropping atomic bombs on distant enemies. Good times, not really. The typical bomber was a high-speed, high-altitude aircraft capable of reaching industrial centers in Canada by flying over the Arctic Circle. The best defense against these long-range bombers were lightning-fast interceptors capable of cutting off an approaching bomber before hitting its target. In 1946, the company responsible for building the best Canadian aircraft was Avro Canada Limited, also known as Avro. See what they did there? Over the next 7 years, Avro built the formidable CF-100. Introduced in 1953, the CF-100 stayed in service in the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, until 1981. However, as was the nature of Cold War weaponry, by the time it was introduced to the RCAF fleet in 1953, the CF-100 was already somewhat outdated compared with the jet-powered bombers in development by the USSR. They don't call it an arms race for nothing. So in 1952, the RCAF put together a new set of requirements for the next generation of interceptors. The paper was called the Final Report of the All-Weather Interceptor Requirements Team. Very catchy. Later that year, it was submitted to Avro, establishing the first set of principles that the new interceptor would need to adhere to. The second set of principles was established the following year, 1953. After Avro reviewed the report of requirements, they teamed up with the RCAF to determine the technical and performance specs required for the kind of supersonic interceptor that they were looking for. This culminated in the RCAF specification Air 73, which combines with the report of requirements, created a specific set of qualifications and details of what this next generation interceptor was gonna look like. It was gonna look cool. A team of RCAF officers and engineers led by a man named Ray Foottit toured aircraft manufacturers throughout the US, UK, and France. Avro had experience building aircraft based on designs by other companies, but Foottit's team found that there was nothing in the works anywhere that fit their specs. So they determined to have Avro design it themselves. The first and most important aspect of this new interceptor was gonna be its speed. It had to go really, really fast. Supersonic aircraft were still relatively new and many struggled to deal with wave drag, a kind of drag that only affects planes as they approach Mach 1. Avro determined to go at this problem with a solution discovered by German engineers during World War II. The research showed that variances in the shape of a plane's wings were the main factor in reducing drag and crossing the sound barrier. Simultaneously, the plane needed large enough wings to provide space for armaments and additional fuel. Fuel space was particularly important as the early jet engines of the 1950s were not exactly what you would call efficient. What you would call them is terribly, terribly inefficient. The optimal wing choice to meet these requirements was the delta wing shaped in the form of a triangle. You see, like this. Not only does the wing shape allow for additional storage, but the increased surface area allows the plane to create more lift at higher altitudes than planes with smaller wings. While the delta wing sacrificed some speed and maneuverability at lower altitudes, these disadvantages were minimized because interceptors were rarely called upon to do anything besides fly in a really straight line at a really high altitude. As for the more specific configurations of the Air 73 specs, the RCAF requested a plane with a range of 556 kilometers, 345 miles, for a routine low-speed mission, and 370 kilometers, 230 miles, for a high-speed interception mission. It needed a cruising speed of Mach 1.5 at an altitude of 21,000 meters, that's 70,000 feet, and the ability to take off from a 1.8 kilometer, 6,000 feet runway. It would need to maintain speed and altitude while sustaining 2 Gs of force during high-altitude maneuvers, and it must be able to turn around on the ground within 10 minutes. So I could do this. Easy. No problem. Avro submitted their design for these specs in May 1953 for a plane that was officially referred to as the C-105. Their plans were essentially for a two-man version of one of their earlier planes, but with a single delta wing built into the upper fuselage. This wing placement allowed the belly of the aircraft to be used for storing massive amounts of armaments. The plane's engine was designated as the Rolls-Royce RB-106. In December of 1953, the Canadian government appropriated 27 million Canadian dollars, which is about 200 million US dollars in today's money, for the project. However, the following year, the Soviets introduced a new jet bomber to their fleet, the MYASISHCHEV M4 BISON. Furthermore, reports from Canadian allies claimed that the Soviets were testing an early iteration of the hydrogen bomb. Uh-oh. These two pieces of news seem to spook the Canadian government. Why would that be? Into upping the funding for the project. So, in March of 1955, with the project already underway, the Canadian government approved an additional 260 million Canadian dollars, which is about $2 billion in US dollars today, of funding. That is quite the jump in budget. By mid-1954, the earliest tests began, including rudimentary computer-based testing and real-world testing with small models. The models were tested in wind tunnels and on Canadian and American military bases. The models were approximately 3 meters long, and their purpose was to determine the effectiveness of the design's aerodynamic drag and stability. So, the prototypes were powered by NASA Nike rockets, and they were a success. One of the model planes, launched from a NASA facility in Wallops Island, Virginia, reportedly reached Mach 1.7. Following these tests, the models were crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, leading to something of an obsession with aeronautic enthusiasts who have reportedly searched the ocean floor for whatever they can find of the lost models. They've never been able to find any. The ocean's really big, and models generally really small. I mean, even a plane would be really small. It's the ocean. It's massive. The most significant speed bump of the pre-production days involved the plane's engine. First, the Rolls-Royce RB-106 program was cancelled in 1954, forcing the team at Avro to use a backup, the WRIGHT J67. Then, in 1955, the J67 program was cancelled, forcing Avro to look for different engines again. This time, they went with the Pratt & Whitney J75, while also developing a custom engine for the plane's future iterations. These two engines were eventually cancelled. Not really. These two engine changes forced the engineering team to alter the design multiple times to account for changes in the engine's weight and shape. However, it seemed that they had finally found a keeper. Go-ahead on production was given in 1955, and the RCAF set an aggressive timetable by which they wanted the earliest Arrows completed. Avro responded with some questionable production tactics to ensure that they met that timetable. They adopted a system called the Cook-Craigie Plan. While most brand new aircraft went through several prototyping stages before factory production began, the Cook-Craigie Plan called for the first plane to be built from a factory production line. The project engineers knew right away that this was something of a precarious approach to things. In keeping with the project spirit, the RCAF demanded several changes upon seeing the earliest full-scale mock-ups of the plane in 1956. They requested extensive state-of-the-art missiles and weapon systems, even though Avro's plans included more affordable, yet just as capable systems. Because of course they did. So, of course, the military's always right, and they changed the design to meet the new specifications. The new weapon systems would take several more years to complete, but this apparently wasn't a concern for the RCAF. This kind of change and cancellation typified much of the Arrow's production history, causing delays that led to increased costs and the Canadian government's frustration. Despite all the problems, the first Avro Arrow was completed in late 1957 with an official rollout date of October 4th, 1957. The team planned a colossal ceremony and invited 13,000 aeronautic enthusiasts and press members to witness the event. However, they received next to no publicity that week, as their rollout date happened to be the same day that the Sputnik satellite was launched. Bummer. The first flight took place 6 months later, on March 25th, 1958. The plane wasn't quite finished yet, as few of the armaments were ready, so the engineering team added ballasts to balance the plane's weight. The test pilot for the first flight was Janusz Zurakowski, and his tests revealed no significant faults. The aircraft reached supersonic speed on its third flight, and on its seventh broke 1,600 kilometers an hour, 1,000 miles per hour, while climbing upwards of 15,000 meters, that's 50,000 feet. There are some small discrepancies in the reported Mach speed, but it most likely topped out around Mach 1.95. Over the next 18 months, 4 Mark 1s, the earliest iteration of the Arrow, were built and delivered to the RCAF at last. The final product, it was a beautiful structure, sleek and dramatic with its delta wing style. The plane was 23.7 meters long, 6.45 meters tall, with a wingspan of 15 meters. The total wing area reached 114 square meters, a characteristic found on virtually all delta wing planes. The cruise speed at 11,000 meters, that's 36,000 feet, was 976 kilometers an hour, placing it just below Mach 1. The combat range was 670 kilometers, placing it well above the RCAF efficiency standards in the pre-planning stages. Its service ceiling also maxed out at 16,000 meters, 53,000 feet, and though the max recorded speed was 2,104 kilometers an hour, many of the engineers and pilots believed that it had the potential to crack Mach 2. Since the program's earliest days in 1953, the Arrow had been a target of civilian and military criticism as honestly just a poor use of money. The leadership of the Canadian Army and Navy were highly critical of the extensive funds given to the Air Force. Remember how much money they were given? It was insane. Politically, it was seen as an example of rampant liberal spending. In 1957, a progressive conservative named John Diefenbaker won election for the Prime Minister of Canada after campaigning on reduced spending. Shortly after his election, Diefenbaker signed the NORAD agreement with the United States, making Canada a partner in America's command and control. This included the opportunity to coordinate with the USA's defense of North America through the use of the SAGE system, which was focused on using anti-aircraft missiles to defend against air-based attacks. Another new priority was defending against long-range ballistic missiles or even attacks from space, as Sputnik might have signified. Altogether, it meant that the Avro Arrow looked more like an expensive piece of equipment that wasn't quite as effective as it was initially supposed to be. It looked like a weapon that was meant to stop an enemy that really wasn't there anymore. Furthermore, many of the project's components, including the armament system, were still yet to be completed. Because of course they were. On February the 20th, 1959, Diefenbaker announced the cancellation of the Avro Arrow program. He cited the changing threats to Canada's defense and the massive costs of building the new weapon. While the SAGE program, which Diefenbaker eventually joined, would cost just as much as the Arrow program, it was seen as a more realistic counter to the Soviet Union's potential threat. The day became known as Black Friday in the Canadian aviation industry, as 15,000 Avro employees suddenly found themselves without jobs, and Canada's aircraft manufacturing industry never reached the same heights. This led to a brain drain as the best and brightest engineers left Canada for the United States, where they could continue to work on ambitious and expensive projects that would take advantage of their expertise. A team of 25 elite Avro engineers joined NASA to play a massive role in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo projects of the following decades. Following the project's demise, the Canadian government ordered everything related to the Arrow project to be destroyed. They feared the program was infiltrated by Soviet spies, a fear that might actually have been justified, and that any knowledge of the plane and its weapon system needed to be destroyed for national security purposes. These orders were mostly followed, as the only remaining pieces of the 5 Arrows are a single nose section and 2 wing parcels. They can now be seen at the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. In retrospect, it seems the Avro Arrow was destined to never be built on a large scale, perhaps because it would have been so spectacular. While the production and design problems were dealt with, maybe the biggest problem with the airplane was who was building it. World War II was an excuse for excessive spending on military weaponry and infrastructure, but costs soared as technology improved throughout the Cold War. As such, the number of countries that could justify building such pricey jet engine aircraft dwindled until it was essentially just 2 countries, the USA and the USSR. It's disappointing that no fully functional Avro Arrows exist, but it seems that, in retrospect, its cancellation might have been a prudent choice. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, smash that like button below. If you want to look cool with a Delta Wing, megamerch.co is where you go. There's also a link below, and don't forget to subscribe to side projects, because you watched to the end, why wouldn't you? And thanks for watching.